All right, here we go. It is time for the AMSCO 4.4 video. So, let's get to it. Chapter 4.4 is titled Maritime Empires Link Regions. And just so you can see to my left, it's quite a dense little chunk of notes, but I promise you're going to make it. So, here's a summary. The development of sea-based maritime empires led to changes in the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia. Here is the vocabulary for maritime empires link regions, chapter 4.4. There is a tremendous amount of it. Number 1, indentured servitude. When servants agreed to work for a certain period of time in exchange for passage to the Americas. In general, indentured servitude is just when you agree to work for free for a certain period of time to get some kind of benefit out of it. It's sort of like temporary slavery. Chattel slavery is forced labor where people are considered property, so you can actually buy and sell people. The Asante Empire is a West African empire that traded with Europeans. Very brief map break over here. There's the Asante Kingdom, kind of south of where Mali was. And there's Congo down there. Kingdom of the Congo, I just showed it to you. It's a southern West African empire that traded with Portugal, a little further down the coast. The Ming Dynasty ruled China from 1368 to 1644. They end up restricting foreign trade after the voyages of Zheng He or Zheng He, depending how you say it. The Aztec Empire was an indigenous empire in what is now much of Mexico. The Inca Empire, indigenous empire in western South America. New Spain is a Spanish colony where the Aztecs once ruled, established in 1521. Mexico City is the Spanish city built on the ruins of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. They tore down the temple in Tenochtitlan and they used the stones to build a gigantic church that you can go visit today. Francisco Pizarro is the Spanish conquistador who led the conquest of the Inca Empire. Atahualpa was the ruler of the Inca Empire who was killed by Pizarro in 1533. Pizarro took him prisoner and tried to ransom him and said, "Fill a room with gold and I will let your ruler go." And they filled the room with gold and Pizarro killed him anyway. Next, the Treaty of Tordesillas was basically an agreement between Spain and Portugal, and they just divided the entire New World between Portugal and Spain. The whole thing. I think I have a little graphic for you later. Hispaniola is the island in the Caribbean where Christopher Columbus first arrived. Today, it's where Haiti and the Dominican Republic are located. Again, that's the island of Hispaniola. The encomienda system is a system where indigenous people are forced to work in exchange for food and shelter, kind of like the way serfdom worked in Europe. They often were put to work mining gold and silver. Encomenderos are the rich landowners in the encomienda system. Coercive labor system is any system of forced work. When you coerce someone to do something, you sort of make them do it. The hacienda system is a system of large plantations where indigenous people farmed for Spanish landowners, often by force. Silver. You know what silver is, but it's important to know that it's mined for profit in Mexico and South America, especially where Bolivia is today. There's a big silver mine there. The Mita system you learned about earlier in the year, that was the Incan system of labor obligation where young men would go work on public projects for a certain period of time. Mercantilism, an economic system used by European countries. The goal is to gain colonies and resources and force your colonies to buy things from you so you can make more money. Colonies are claimed lands settled by immigrants from the home country. And the Middle Passage is the name for the journey that enslaved Africans took across the Atlantic to the Americas. All right. So, chapter 4.4, first subtopic is called State Building and Empire Expansion. So, in a nutshell, European countries, states, created maritime empires by taking over new territories all over the globe. They set up trading posts in Africa and Asia. The Portuguese set them up on the West African coast. And they brought their gunpowder weapons and traded them for enslaved people. And this caused a lot of war down in that area because you've got new kingdoms that have gunpowder weapons, so they go ahead and expand and they enslave more people to get more weapons, and then more wars break out. So it created a lot of chaos on the West African coast. The Portuguese also conquered the cities of Kilwa and Mombasa on the east coast of Africa. These were important trading centers, and the Portuguese basically sacked them and took all the valuable stuff and took over the cities. They were key for Indian Ocean trade. Now, Japan, at this same time, when Europe is bouncing all over the Pacific and Indian Oceans, Japan is restricting trade with Europe, and they banned Christianity in 1587. They said, we do not want this European influence. We don't want the Europeans to come mess with us, and we certainly don't really want anything they have to offer, and so we're going to close it down and stay closed. So from the 1630s, when they finally kicked out most of the Europeans, into the 1800s, Japan is very isolated from the rest of the world. At this time, China tried to do something similar under the Ming Dynasty, which tried to reduce contact with foreigners. So, more on this section. We're still in 4.4, but there's more information in this subtopic of this chapter. So, one section is called the European Rivalries on 5 Continents. So the British, Portuguese, and French all eventually controlled trading posts in India and Africa. And think of a trading post as like a little piece of land, kind of like a mini city where you can bring your goods and you can buy and you can sell. The British noticed that the Mughal Empire was becoming less tolerant of Hindus, because the Mughals are Muslims and most of India is Hindu. And so they started making alliances with the Hindu kingdoms, saying, hey, let's work together and push these Mughals back a little bit and expand our territory, and we'll be much nicer to you than the Mughals are. Eventually, of course, the British are just going to go ahead and conquer most of India. But at the time, some of the local Hindus were like, maybe you're nicer than the Mughals. Like, maybe we can let you in. Europeans in the Americas. All right, so Spanish conquistadors took over the Aztec and the Inca empires, which you might have learned about back in Texas history, possibly. So Cortez took over the Aztecs in 1521, and Pizarro conquered the Incas in a much longer conflict, but between 1533 and 1572, beginning with kidnapping and killing the Inca emperor Atahualpa. Cortez and the Aztecs, one of the ways that he's able to conquer the Aztecs more quickly is the Aztecs had a large empire and they were forcing lots of different communities near them to pay tribute. So Cortez went around all these communities and said, hey, you don't like the Aztecs? Come with me and we'll go conquer the Aztecs together. Of course, then Cortez took over all that area in the name of Spain and created a new empire himself. So in 1494, Spain and Portugal get together and they say, wow, there's this whole new world. We don't know how big it is yet, but it's really big. And so we should get together and we should have it all. And so they divide it and they pick this dividing line. Unfortunately, they pick a line and it just gives Portugal Brazil, and then Spain gets everything else. And let's see if I can find that. The thing that's really neat about this is that they just don't know how big the new world is. So they've gotten into the new world and they say, look, we know there's a bunch of land over here in the Caribbean. And we also there's land over here. So Portugal, you can get this. Everything over here, it's all yours. And then Spain, you get whatever's left over here. It just turns out there's a lot more over here than they realized at the time. So that is that. Moving right along. All right. So Britain and France are fighting for control of North America. And there's a big war called the 7 Years' War that becomes this big global conflict. The parts in America are often referred to as the French and Indian War. But long story short, Britain beats France and pushes the French out of most of Canada and also out of most of Eastern North America. Continuity and change in economic systems is the next subtopic in chapter 4.4. So here we go. Before the Portuguese arrived, most Indian Ocean trade was done by merchant ships that were not armed. There's kind of a fairly peaceful trade going on there. The Portuguese show up with superior weapons and fast ships, and they take control of a bunch of trading posts. And they kind of come in and they flex. And so the thing is, once the Portuguese take over these areas, trade kind of gets back to normal. You'll notice in history, a lot of time, business people, they mostly just want to make money. So if there's a war, they'll kind of lay low, try to figure out who's going to win. But in the end, once the Portuguese establish themselves, business kind of goes on as usual. Spain is trying to make money, so they set up these forced labor systems in the Americas. You got the encomienda system, which you mentioned in the vocabulary section. Basically, they took over the Native Americans and said, okay, look, we're the new lords and you're the new serfs, and so you're going to live on this land, you're going to work for us, we're going to be really nice to you, we're going to give you a place to stay, we're going to give you some food, and just obey us. The hacienda system is very similar with plantations. So instead of being forced to dig in a mine, you're forced to farm. One interesting cultural thing that happens is that the Spanish immigrants are mostly men. And they go out and they're like, we're going to take over the world. And they get there and they conquer. And then they settle down and they end up starting families with indigenous women. What happens differently in the British colonies is the British often come over with their whole family. So it's like the husband, the wife, the kids. And so there's not like a mixed culture between Europeans and Native Americans in the same way that there is in, say, Mexico and South America. Spain and the other European countries adopt this policy called mercantilism, which I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to explain it just a little bit more. So the idea is the government is going to control the economy, and they're going to try to make the country as rich as possible. And the way they do that is by setting up colonies. So the colonies provide things like precious metals and wood and fur and tobacco. And then the home countries, like say England, they take all that stuff and they make things like cigars and cigarettes and chairs and tables, and they sell things back to the colonies. And so they're making money by extracting resources from the colonies, and they're also making money by selling things back to the colonies. Then what they do is they make rules saying, look, you can't trade with anybody else. You colonies only can trade with us. And so they set up these high tariffs, these high taxes on imports from other countries to keep money in their home country. So they might say, look, we don't want you buying any fancy dresses from France. If you do, you got to pay a crazy tariff. And so really, you should buy our, British cloth, and that's going to basically keep money in Britain. So it's kind of a way of extracting wealth from your colonies. It's called mercantilism. The British were doing it, and the French were doing it. Other European countries are doing it as well. Got to know that. All right, continuity and change in labor systems. What stays the same and what changes? So here's a little summary. Different forms of labor, especially slave labor, influenced the era from 1450 to 1750. And there were not a ton of people who came with them. So they're looking for laborers to work on this land, trying to figure out how do you get people to work this land and where do you find them? So first thing they did is they had indentured servants from Europe, but they would work for like 7 years and then they're free. And so you've got some labor for a bit, but then, they want to go off and work. They want to get paid. You'd rather not pay people if you don't have to. So next thing they did is they enslaved Native Americans. But as I mentioned earlier, they often died from disease or they escaped. And if you are native to an area and you escape slavery, you probably can find someone who's going to help you hide. You can blend into the population. It's hard to find you. So next thing they decided to do is they would try to enslave people from Africa. They noticed that the Africans were more resistant to Afro-Eurasian diseases because they've been in contact with Europeans before. They're also less likely to escape because they don't know the land and they don't have any sort of social networks to hide them once they do escape. So the Atlantic slave trade is a trade where people in Africa are kidnapped by neighboring kingdoms or were taken prisoner during wars. And then they're taken to the coast of West Africa to these kind of prisons called slave castles. And after that, they're crammed together on this terrible journey called the Middle Passage, which is the name for the trip across the Atlantic. And at this point, they're basically treating people like non-human cargo. So 15 10 to 15% of slaves would die along the journey just as a given. So imagine, for instance, that someone takes your whole classroom and says, okay, you're all going to be slaves now. And by the way, 10 to 15% of you are going to die, but it's the cost of doing business. So get on the boat and, hopefully most of you get there. It's really a terrible thing. It's like a stain in the history of humanity, and it's awful. Slavery at this time led to a population decline in Africa, and not all of slaves from Africa ended up going to the Americas. Some of them in East Africa were taken as slaves in the Indian Ocean slave trade and sent to the East. One interesting difference there is that they usually had more rights, especially in Muslim communities, and like they could do things like marry and possibly eventually become free. And what you notice today in Muslim countries is they're not generally separated into different sort of racial communities the way that people are in America. So it's an interesting sort of cultural consequence of how the different societies interacted during this time. And that's the end of chapter 4.4.